There are summers that melt into golden memories, and then there's the kind Harry Potter was having. Imagine this. The sun is beating down relentlessly, the streets are bone dry, the grass is yellowed and crisp, and not a whisper of magic in sight. But for Harry, that wasn't even the worst part. No, the worst part was the silence. The silence from everyone who mattered. No letters from Ron. Nothing from Hermione. Even Dumbledore, the one person Harry thought he could count on, was giving him the cold shoulder. And sure, the Dursleys were being their usual lovely selves, if by lovely you mean treating him like he carried a contagious disease. It had been a month since Cedric Diggory died, since Voldemort came back. And yet, here Harry was, stuck in little whinging like nothing had changed. As if he hadn't watched someone die. As if he hadn't fought for his life. As if the most dangerous wizard of all time hadn't returned. But the wizarding world? Quiet. Too quiet. Even the Daily Prophet was pretending like Voldemort was just a bad dream. Harry was angry. Furious, actually. He wasn't just being ignored, he was being erased. Silenced. The truth was being buried, and he could feel it in every lonely minute he spent at number 4 Privet Drive. And then there was the weird feeling, always like someone was watching him. Not paranoia. Something deeper. Instinct. That feeling became more than a hunch one sweltering evening, when Harry and his cousin Dudley, who had grown from a piglet into a bulldozer of a teenager, ran into something far worse than school bullies. Dementors. Yes, Dementors. And little whinging. If there was any moment that truly kicked this story into motion, it was that one. 2 soul-sucking creatures from Azkaban, gliding through the alley like death itself had come for a walk. And suddenly Harry wasn't some angry teen in a muggle neighborhood anymore. He was a wizard again. He drew his wand. He cast a Patronus. And in a swirl of silver light, the Dementors fled. He had saved Dudley. But that didn't win him any medals. Because minutes later, he was back at Privet Drive, with an owl swooping in to deliver a letter from the Ministry of Magic. He was expelled. Expelled for using magic in front of a muggle. It didn't matter that it was self-defense. It didn't matter that the alternative was being kissed by a Dementor. No, rules were rules. And Harry had broken them. But before Harry could pack his trunk and storm off into exile, another letter came. A softer tone this time. He wasn't expelled, yet. There would be a hearing. A full-scale trial at the Ministry of Magic. For a 5th-year student. What was going on? Thankfully, he didn't have to sit and stew in the Dursleys' house much longer. One night, a group of witches and wizards burst into his room. Among them, Mad-Eye Moody, Lupin, Tonks, Shacklebolt. All members of something called the Order of the Phoenix, an old resistance group from the First Wizarding War. Dumbledore had reactivated it. Voldemort's return might have been denied by the papers, but the war had quietly begun again. Their mission, get Harry out. Safely. Quietly. And where were they taking him? Number 12 Grimmauld Place. A house hidden in the very cracks of London itself. A place that only appeared when you were told it existed. A place full of dust, darkness, and secrets. And most importantly, a place where Harry finally got to see his people again. Sirius Black opened the door. His godfather. The man who had escaped Azkaban. The one link Harry had to his parents. Inside Grimmauld Place, things weren't exactly warm and cozy. The house belonged to the Black family, pure-blood supremacists. Every corner hissed with hatred. The portrait of Sirius's mother screamed from the walls. House elf creature muttered slurs under his breath. It was a haunted place, but a fortress nonetheless. The Order used this house as their headquarters. Here Harry learned the truth. Voldemort was back. But the Ministry didn't want to admit it. Cornelius Fudge, the Minister of Magic, believed Dumbledore was trying to usurp him. So rather than face the truth, they decided to silence it. Discredit Dumbledore. Discredit Harry. The Daily Prophet had been smearing him for weeks. Unstable. Attention-seeking. Delusional. No wonder Ron and Hermione's letters had been so vague. They were under strict orders to say nothing. The adults were afraid the Ministry might be monitoring owls. Harry had been left in the dark for his own protection. But now the Order was preparing. Gathering intel. Watching Death Eater movements. Trying to protect the few who still believed Voldemort was out there. Harry wanted to help. Desperately. But he was too young. Too inexperienced. So he was told once again to wait. Then came the hearing. Harry was escorted to the Ministry of Magic, this time not as a visitor, but as a defendant. Fudge was there. Dolores Umbridge too. The courtroom felt more like an inquisition. The goal wasn't to assess the facts. It was to make an example of Harry. To destroy his credibility. But Dumbledore showed up. Not warm, not gentle, but precise. Cool. Brilliant. He pointed out the law. Harry had used magic in the presence of a muggle, but only because his life and Dudley's were in danger. A clear case of underage magic being permitted. In the end, Harry was cleared of all charges. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed between him and Dumbledore. There was distance now. Walls. And Dumbledore wasn't trying to tear them down. Still, he was allowed to return to Hogwarts. You'd think that would have brought some relief. But it didn't. Because Hogwarts didn't feel like home anymore. The Ministry hadn't stopped at a smear campaign. They had placed one of their own in the school. Dolores Jane Umbridge. Pink. Prissy. Poisonous. She was the new Defense Against the Dark Arts teacher. But that was just the beginning. She was also appointed as Hogwarts High Inquisitor, a role created by the Ministry to keep the school in check. Her classes didn't teach defense. They taught obedience, theory, memorization, no spells, no practice. And when students pushed back, detentions, with blood quills, Harry was forced to write over and over, "I must not tell lies." The words etched themselves into his skin. But Harry wouldn't stay silent. Not this time. And he wasn't alone. Hermione had an idea, a secret group where they could learn real defense magic. In secret. On their own. They called it Dumbledore's Army. And that's where the real resistance began. So here's the thing about Hogwarts in Harry's 5th year. It wasn't just a school anymore. It was a battleground. Not with spells flying through the hallways or Death Eaters storming the gates. Not yet. But something darker had taken root. Fear. Censorship. Control. And it wore pink cardigans and a tight-lipped smile. Dolores Umbridge wasn't just a teacher. She was a Ministry operative. A spy in plain sight. Every decree she posted on the wall was like a chain tightening around the school's neck. First it was classroom rules. Then clubs were banned. Then professors were inspected. It was like living inside a cage built with rules instead of bars. And no one felt the squeeze more than Harry. He was still dealing with the trauma of Cedric's death. The constant whispers calling him a liar. The strange, sharp pain that kept blooming in his scar, hot and sudden, like a lightning strike behind his eyes. Voldemort was doing something, Harry could feel it. But no one believed him. Not the Ministry. Not the papers. And now, not even the students. Well, not all the students. Because while Umbridge was busy sucking the soul out of Hogwarts with rules and fake smiles, Hermione was building a rebellion. Not a loud one. A quiet one. A smart one. Dumbledore's Army. The idea was simple. Teach themselves. Learn what the Ministry refused to let them learn. Practice the spells that might one day save their lives. Not just Harry, all of them. Ron. Hermione. Neville. Luna. Ginny. Dozens of students ready to fight back in the only way they could. By getting ready. But first they needed a place to meet. Enter the Room of Requirement. A room that appears when you need it most, hidden away on the 7th floor. You walk past it 3 times thinking about what you need and boom, there it is. A room filled with cushions, books and everything they needed to train. That room became their sanctuary. And in that room Harry became a teacher. At first he doubted himself. Who was he to lead anything? He didn't feel wise, or powerful, or even stable. But the others didn't see a damaged boy, they saw someone who had been through it. Who had fought, survived, stood up to Voldemort. They believed in him before he believed in himself. He taught them the real stuff, stunning spells, disarming charms, shield spells, patron uses. Every session made them stronger, more confident. Even Neville, once the clumsiest among them, began to shine. Because this was about more than defense. It was about reclaiming power, in a place that had stolen it from them. But even as this secret army grew, the pressure outside that room kept building. Umbridge wasn't just suspicious, she was ruthless. She began recruiting her own little band of informants. Students who were all too happy to trade loyalty for power. The Inquisitorial Squad. Mostly Slytherins. Bullies with permission. And her reach went deeper than anyone expected. She banned anything that smelled like dissent. She had Trelawney sobbing on the steps after firing her. She nearly kicked Hagrid out. And she started watching everyone. The walls were closing in. But Harry had bigger problems than pink tyranny. Because his dreams were getting stranger. Every night he was somewhere else. In a corridor. Long silent. Endless. At the end was a door, always locked. He didn't know why, but he needed to open it. And then one night he was no longer just dreaming. He was inside something real. He became a snake. He could feel the cold scales against the floor, the hunger in his belly, the raw instinct to strike. He saw a man, Mr. Weasley, and he attacked him. Harry woke up screaming. It wasn't just a nightmare. Mr. Weasley had really been attacked. By a snake. Just like in Harry's vision. But how? How could Harry have seen it? Dumbledore knew the answer. Voldemort wasn't just back, he was inside Harry's mind. Their connection ran deeper than anyone had realized. Harry was more than a target, he was a window. So Dumbledore did something unexpected. He pulled away even more. He sent Snape, yes Snape, to teach Harry occlumency, the magical art of closing your mind, of blocking off intrusions. It was brutal, violent, cold. Snape had no mercy and Harry hated every minute of it. But the truth was terrifying. If Harry didn't learn to shut Voldemort out, the consequences could be catastrophic. Still, the lessons were going nowhere. Harry couldn't block the visions, couldn't stop the dreams. And the door at the end of the hallway in his mind, was closer than ever. While Harry was struggling in secret, Dumbledore's army kept training. The bonds between the students grew. It wasn't just about spells anymore. It was about trust, loyalty, resistance. They believed in each other, in what they were doing. It was the most alive Harry had felt in months. But like all rebellions, they were living on borrowed time. Because someone snitched. The secret was out. Umbridge knew about the DA. She stormed the room of requirement with her squad. The group scattered. Harry was dragged to Dumbledore's office, expecting the worst. But what happened next changed everything. They had no proof Harry started the group. The only signature on the list was Dumbledore's army. So Umbridge, smug as ever, accused Dumbledore of orchestrating the whole thing. And Dumbledore? He didn't deny it. He stood, calm and confident, and said something Harry would never forget. If you're going to take me, you'll have to do it by force. Then, with a flash of fire and a screech of a phoenix, Dumbledore disappeared. He had left Hogwarts. And now, Umbridge was in charge. Not just of defense against the dark arts. Not just the inquisitorial squad. She was now the headmistress. The castle itself seemed to groan in protest. Portraits turned their backs. Peeves caused chaos. McGonagall barely hid her contempt. The air was thick with fear, but also something else. Resistance. But Harry? Harry was spiraling. He had lost his mentor. His dream visions were getting stronger. He still couldn't control them. And something was happening at the Ministry, something Voldemort wanted behind that locked door. He had to find out what. And when the time came, he would. Let's pause for a second. By this point, Harry's year has already gone completely off the rails. He's been attacked by Dementors, dragged into a Ministry trial, labeled a liar by the wizarding world, tortured with a blood quill, kicked out of his own secret club. And now Dumbledore, the one person who could protect him, is gone. And still, one question buzzes inside his mind like a wasp trapped in a jar. What is behind the door? That door, the one from his dreams, the one at the end of the endless corridor in the Ministry, wasn't just a symbol anymore. Voldemort wanted it, needed it. Harry could feel it. The Order was whispering about a weapon. Something Voldemort was desperate to get his hands on. Something the Ministry had. Something Dumbledore was guarding. And somehow Harry was connected to it all. But with Dumbledore gone and Umbridge watching his every move, he had no way of finding answers. So life at Hogwarts became a different kind of prison. Umbridge wasn't just enforcing rules, she was reshaping the school in her image. She silenced teachers. She controlled the news. She banned gatherings. In her office, it became a surveillance center. She had enchanted quills, listening devices, even cats on the wallpaper that somehow watched you back. She used fear like it was a spell. Still, the spirit of resistance didn't die. Fred and George, the Weasley twins, turned their pranks into full-blown anarchy. Portable swamps, exploding fireworks, puking pastilles in the hallways. Every prank was a protest. Every laugh was a crack in Umbridge's power. But Harry wasn't laughing. Not anymore. Because the visions were growing stronger. More vivid. Sometimes he wasn't himself in them, he was Voldemort. Feeling what Voldemort felt. Thinking what he thought. It wasn't just disturbing, it was dangerous. Especially when one night, Harry had a vision that made his blood run cold. Serious, tortured, screaming. Inside the Department of Mysteries. And suddenly, everything sharpened. The corridor. The door. The weapon. The fear. It all pointed to one thing. Voldemort had lured Sirius there. And Harry had to save him. He couldn't go to Umbridge, she'd never let him leave the school. So he and his friends, Hermione, Ron, Ginny, Luna, and Neville, came up with a plan. A wild, insane, probably illegal plan. but it was the only one they had. They tricked Umbridge into her own downfall. Hermione pretended to know where Dumbledore had hidden a secret weapon in the Forbidden Forest. Umbridge followed, but she didn't find a weapon. She found centaurs, and they didn't take kindly to Ministry officials. Let's just say, she didn't make it out with her dignity intact. With Umbridge gone and chaos erupting behind them, the 6 of them snuck out of the school. They flew to London on Thestrals. Yes, those eerie skeletal horses only visible to those who had seen death. For Harry it was Cedric. For Luna, her mother. They all rode in silence, slicing through the midnight sky. They reached the Ministry, the Department of Mysteries. It was surreal, endless halls, shimmering orbs, whispering shadows. Rooms filled with time, space, death, love. Places that twisted the rules of reality. And at the heart of it, the prophecy room. Glass spheres lined the shelves. Harry felt drawn to one in particular. And on the label, Harry Potter and Lord Voldemort. He reached out, touched it, took it, and then, ambush. Death Eaters flooded in. Lucius Malfoy, Bellatrix Lestrange. Dozens of them. Voldemort had played them all. The vision of Sirius was a trap, bait to lure Harry into retrieving the prophecy. The 6 students were surrounded, outnumbered, but they fought. They fought like their lives, and the lives of everyone they loved, depended on it, because they did. And somehow, against impossible odds, they held their ground. Stunning spells, disarming spells, spells that missed, spells that hit. Neville's nose was broken. Hermione was cursed. Ron was nearly killed by a brain in a jar. But they didn't give up. And then, help came. The Order of the Phoenix arrived. Sirius, Lupin, Tonks, Kingsley, Mad-Eye. The battle turned into chaos. Spells flying in every direction. Glass shattering. People screaming. The prophecy still clutched in Harry's hand. And then, Bellatrix Lestrange laughed. Because with one final flick of her wand, she sent Sirius flying through the veil. That veil. That curtain. That deathly, whispering archway in the center of the room. Sirius was gone. Just like that. And Harry froze. The fight around him blurred into nothing. He ran. Screamed. Begged. But the truth was simple and cruel. Sirius was dead. The only family he had left, gone in an instant. Bellatrix escaped, taunting Harry with every step. And in that grief, in that rage, something inside Harry snapped. He chased her. He cornered her. And he nearly cast the killing curse. But he couldn't do it. Not fully. Not yet. Because Voldemort was already there. The real one. Not in Harry's dreams. Not in his mind. In the flesh. And for the first time in 15 years, Voldemort and Harry stood face to face, with no one between them. Voldemort was ready to kill. But he didn't count on Dumbledore. The headmaster arrived like a storm. No words. No delay. And what followed was a duel unlike anything Harry had ever seen. Fire. Water. Blast. Magic that bent the room itself. Voldemort was powerful, but Dumbledore was Dumbledore. Controlled. Brilliant. Unshaken. In the end, Voldemort tried to possess Harry, tried to worm his way into his soul. But something stopped him. Something Voldemort didn't understand. Love. Harry's grief. His loyalty. His memories of Sirius. The pain of losing someone he cared for. Those were things Voldemort could never inhabit. He left. Just in time for Fudge and the Ministry to walk in and see Voldemort for themselves. There was no denying it anymore. The war had begun. So, the Ministry had finally seen the truth. Voldemort, the Voldemort, was back. No more rumors. No more lies. No more whispering in corners. Cornelius Fudge, the minister himself, had watched it happen with his own eyes. And just like that, the narrative shattered. The Daily Prophet did a full 180. Now Harry wasn't unbalanced or attention-seeking. He was the boy who warned us all. Dumbledore was welcomed back as if nothing had happened. The same people who doubted them yesterday were now desperate to stand on the right side of history. But for Harry, it didn't feel like a win. Felt like too little, far too late. Sirius was still dead. The prophecy was destroyed. And even though Voldemort had finally been exposed, Harry was left with a hollow, aching silence that no amount of headlines could fill. After the battle, Dumbledore finally sat Harry down. Not with anger. Not with avoidance. But with the truth. And it was time Harry heard everything. That prophecy, the one that shattered during the fight, wasn't lost completely. Dumbledore had heard it once long ago. And he still remembered every word. It went like this. The one with the power to vanquish the Dark Lord approaches. Born to those who have thrice defied him, born as the 7th month dies. Harry froze. That was him. And the Dark Lord will mark him as his equal, but he will have power the Dark Lord knows not. The scar. The connection. Voldemort chose Harry. And either must die at the hand of the other, for neither can live while the other survives. There it was. The prophecy wasn't just a prediction, it was a sentence. One would have to kill the other. There was no way around it. No second option. No escape route. Either Harry kills Voldemort, or Voldemort kills Harry. That was the weapon. Not an object. Not a spell. It was Harry himself. That's what Voldemort had been chasing. Not because he feared it, but because he needed to control it. And now everything made sense. Why Harry could feel Voldemort's emotions. Why the dreams were so vivid. Why he could speak Parseltongue. Why Voldemort had chosen him, not Neville, who also fit the prophecy's birth date. Because in that moment all those years ago Voldemort had made the choice. And that choice made the prophecy true. Harry had been marked. Scarred. Connected to darkness in a way no other wizard was. And the most chilling part? Dumbledore had known. For years. He hadn't told Harry because he wanted to protect him. To give him time. To let him live before carrying that unbearable weight. But time was up now. Harry had lost his parents. Cedric. Sirius. And now the truth. He wasn't just in the war, he was the war. Still, Dumbledore reminded him of something crucial. It is not how you are alike to Voldemort that matters. It's how you are different. Because Harry loved. Deeply. Fiercely. That love, that loyalty to his friends, that grief for Sirius, that aching longing for family, that was power Voldemort would never understand. Could never feel. And in that difference there was still hope. So the school year ended, not with a celebration, but with a quiet understanding. The war had begun. Back at Hogwarts, life moved forward in its strange, solemn way. Umbridge was gone, run out by centaurs and humiliation. Peeves gave her a farewell chase with a cane and a cackling laugh. The students slowly returned to their routines, but the air had changed. People were preparing. Choosing sides. Whispering plans. Even the Ministry, now that it had admitted the truth, was scrambling to act. Aurors were being reassigned. Security was tightened. Azkaban was no longer safe. The Dementors were defecting, drawn to Voldemort's side like moths to a flame. And Harry? He went back to the Dursleys for the summer. But not as the same boy who'd left them. He had been through war. Lost someone he loved. He had seen Voldemort rise and nearly kill again. And now he carried a prophecy in his chest like a ticking clock. But here's what makes Harry different. He didn't give in to hate. He didn't retreat into rage or vengeance. He stood with his friends. Ron, Hermione, Neville, Ginny, Luna. People who had chosen to fight with him, not because they had to, but because they believed in him. They were the real army. The army of those who knew love. Who had tasted loss and still stood up. Who had scars and still chose to protect others. And even though the war had just begun, they were ready. Because the story of Harry Potter isn't just a tale of magic, or school, or spells. It's a story about resistance, about loss, about choosing what's right even when the world is broken, and about a boy with a lightning scar who was never alone, not really, because even in the darkest times, he was surrounded by people who believed in the light. Summer returned. Hot, quiet, heavy, but it didn't feel like freedom. Harry was back at number 4 Privet Drive. Same hedges. Same street. Same plastic smile neighbors pretending everything was normal. But Harry wasn't the same. He wasn't the awkward boy counting down the days to Hogwarts anymore. He was a soldier now. A boy marked by death, haunted by dreams, carrying a prophecy that spelled out his fate in brutal, irreversible ink. And the worst part? There was no one to talk to about it. The Order checked in. Tonks and Lupin made appearances. Moody grunted his way through advice. Even Arthur Weasley offered some fatherly warmth. But none of them really knew what to say to a 15-year-old carrying the weight of an entire war in his chest. Harry didn't even know how to feel. Guilt, rage, sadness. They all twisted together into something quieter, numbness. Sirius was gone. And it wasn't just grief, it was failure. Harry had led his friends into that trap. He'd believed the vision. He'd acted without thinking. And now Sirius was dead because of him. He didn't know how to forgive himself for that. But slowly the fog began to lift. One letter at a time. Ron and Hermione kept writing. Small updates, little jokes, subtle reminders that he wasn't alone. Even Luna, in her wonderfully odd way, sent a message that hit deeper than he expected. Things we lose have a way of coming back to us in the end, if not always in the way we expect. It wasn't a cure, but it was something. The world outside was changing too. Now that Voldemort's return had been confirmed, everything shifted. The wizarding world was no longer in denial, it was in panic. People were disappearing. Families splitting. Old enemies creeping back into power. Azkaban was losing control. The Dementors had left their posts, drifting toward Voldemort like shadows finding their master. Diagon Alley wasn't the same either. Shops boarded up. Posters everywhere. Constant vigilance. Warnings. Witch Watch patrols. The cheerful chaos of shopping for school supplies now carried attention, like everyone was waiting for the next attack. But not everything was falling apart. Fred and George? They were thriving. They dropped out of Hogwarts in spectacular, fireworks-blazing fashion and opened their own shop, Weasley's Wizard Wheezes. It was more than just a joke shop. It was a middle finger to fear. A burst of color in a world turning gray. Even Mrs. Weasley, who had once screamed herself hoarse over their career choices, couldn't deny it. They were doing it. Building something that mattered. It was hope disguised as mischief. Back at Grimmauld Place, the mood was different. Quieter. Sadder. Without Sirius, the house felt like it had lost its heartbeat. Creatures slunk through the shadows, muttering worse than ever. The Black family tapestry hung cold and lifeless, covered in burned-out names and fading legacies. Harry couldn't walk past Sirius's room without feeling like something had been torn from him. But even in grief, life pushed forward. There were meetings, strategy, training. The Order was growing, new faces arriving, new alliances forming. Even Percy Weasley, who had split from his family in blind loyalty to the Ministry, was beginning to feel the tension crack. The lines were being redrawn and no one stayed neutral for long. But one person remained distant. Dumbledore. Yes, he was back. Respected. Reinstated. The wizarding world's savior, again. But Harry still felt the space between them. The conversation they'd had after the Department of Mysteries, about the prophecy, about fate, had changed everything. Their bond was no longer mentor and student. It was something more fragile. There was trust, but also hurt. Still, Dumbledore did something that mattered. He told the rest of the school the truth. When the new term started, he didn't avoid the topic. He stood in front of the students at the welcoming feast and said plainly, "Lord Voldemort has returned." The room froze. Gasp. Fear. Whispers. But it needed to be said. Finally, someone was telling the truth. And Harry? For the first time, he wasn't the only one carrying it. This year at Hogwarts, things weren't going to be easier, but they would be clearer. The Ministry wasn't meddling anymore. Umbridge was gone. Dumbledore had control again. But the castle was different. Students had seen what was coming. They trained. Fought. Some had lost family. Some had scars that didn't show on the outside. Neville walked taller. Luna spoke louder. Even Ginny carried herself with a quiet strength now. They weren't just kids anymore. They were survivors. And Hogwarts wasn't just a school, it was the last safe stronghold in a world falling apart. For Harry, every hallway was a reminder. Every corner whispered Sirius's name. But something had shifted in him. Something deep. He wasn't chasing fame anymore. He wasn't just reacting to danger. Now he understood the mission. This wasn't about glory or vengeance. It was about protecting the people he loved. It was about stopping the kind of pain that had been passed down through generations, from the first Wizarding War to this new one. And so, with a quiet resolve, Harry stepped into the next chapter. He didn't have all the answers. He didn't even know where the path would lead. But he was ready. Because the truth had been spoken. The war had begun. And Harry Potter was no longer a boy just trying to survive. He was becoming the one who would fight. Hogwarts wasn't healing, it was bracing. The wounds from last year hadn't fully closed. Some of them wouldn't. You could still feel it in the silences between classes, in the eyes of the students who had fought in the Department of Mysteries. There was a new weight pressing down on the castle, one that no spell could lift. It was the weight of knowing. Knowing that the world outside was unraveling. Knowing that death could come through the fireplace or in a dream, or through the mind of the boy sitting right next to you. Harry felt it constantly. The prophecy had changed something fundamental in him. Not just because of the words, but because of what it meant. That every choice he made from here on out would be part of a bigger battle. That one day he would stand alone with Voldemort, and only one would live. That kind of knowledge doesn't just sit quietly in your head. It rewires you. Slowly. Quietly. But here's what surprised Harry the most. He didn't feel afraid. He felt focused. Classes resumed, and with them, the slow, deliberate return to rhythm. But not everything was the same. The DA was officially disbanded, but its spirit remained. Spells were practiced in secret corners. Eyes met across corridors with the quiet nod of shared history. Students remembered what they had learned, not just the magic but the why. And then came the headlines. More disappearances, attacks, Muggle deaths. The ministry, now desperate to regain credibility, created new divisions. Public statements, crackdowns, orders were stretched thin. Fear was spreading like frost over glass, silent and sudden. Even inside Hogwarts, the war had started seeping in. Not through battle, but through belief. Some students refused to accept what was happening. Some still claimed Voldemort's return was exaggerated. Others whispered that Dumbledore had an agenda. And for the first time in a long time, the danger wasn't just coming from outside. It was coming from within. Meanwhile, Harry's scar began to throb again. It wasn't as sharp as before, but it was there, always there. A quiet pulse. A signal. He still couldn't control it, still couldn't shut Voldemort out completely. Snape's occlumency lessons had failed. The connection remained, and with it came something stranger. Emotion. Sometimes Harry would feel sudden waves of fury. Other times cold triumph. Or desire. And it wasn't his. It was Voldemort's. It was like being haunted, not by a ghost, but by a living enemy whose mind occasionally slipped into yours. Dumbledore knew. But even he didn't know how to sever it. And maybe he didn't want to. Because that link might be dangerous, but it was also a window. A window into the mind of the enemy. A weapon if used correctly. But also a curse. Then came the whispers of something darker. Horcruxes. Harry didn't know the term yet, but Dumbledore was already digging. Researching. Traveling. Leaving the castle for days, searching for traces of the unthinkable. He didn't tell Harry much, not yet. But something in his expression had changed. A tightness behind his words. A knowledge that whatever was coming, it would demand more than spells or wands. It would demand understanding. And sacrifice. The Weasley family too had changed. Bill was working with Gringotts on foreign assignments. Charlie sent back encrypted letters from Romania. Percy remained estranged, still blindly loyal to the ministry. But the heart of the family, Molly Weasley, remained the same. Steady. Loving. Worried sick. She hosted secret dinners for the order. Kept the kettle boiling. Tried to preserve normalcy in a world that had none. And Ron? Ron was growing into himself. He wasn't just the sidekick anymore. He'd taken on responsibilities, supporting Harry, protecting Ginny, helping Fred and George when they asked. The trio, Harry, Ron, and Hermione, felt older now. Not in years but in where. They didn't speak in the same giddy tones as first years. They planned. Questioned. Prepared. Hermione as always read everything. She was the strategist. The one who looked at the coming storm and started building shelter with books and logic. But she too carried fear. Not for herself. For Harry. Because even she couldn't calculate her way out of a prophecy. Then came the letter from Hagrid. It was short. Vague. Meet me tonight. Don't bring anyone. It's important. So Harry went. What he found surprised him. Not danger. Not news. A giant. Hagrid's half-brother, Grop. Nearly 16 feet tall. Wild. Confused. Dangerous. Hagrid had found him on a mission for the Order and secretly brought him back to the Forbidden Forest. What? Because Hagrid was afraid Grop would be killed. And family mattered more than safety. It was reckless. Foolish. But it was love. And Harry understood that more than he ever had. As spring crept in, the castle bloomed in ways the students barely noticed. But beneath the sunlight and green grass, the tension was building. The whispers. The disappearances. The cold reality that Hogwarts, once the safest place in the world, was now merely less dangerous than everywhere else. The lines were being drawn. Not just between good and evil, but between courage and denial. Truth and comfort. And Harry? He had stopped waiting for someone else to lead. He was preparing. Quietly. Constantly. Because he knew the storm wasn't over. The prophecy was real. And the final confrontation was coming. The prophecy wasn't just a sentence. It was a sentence. A life sentence. A destiny Harry hadn't chosen but now had to live inside of every second. Even with the days getting warmer, even as exams loomed and Quidditch matches raged, there was no normal anymore. Not really. Because the war wasn't coming. It was already here. Just hidden. Just waiting. One of the first signs came quietly, almost like a whisper between trees. A few students from other houses stopped sneering. Some even nodded at Harry in the halls. Some even asked him questions. Serious questions. About what happened in the Department of Mysteries. about what it felt like to fight Death Eaters, about whether Voldemort was really that powerful. Harry never claimed to be the expert, but his scars spoke before he did. People listened now, not because he was special, but because he was scarred. Fred and George, well, they didn't wait for permission. After the chaos of the previous year, they doubled down on rebellion. They weren't just pranksters anymore. They were businessmen, revolutionaries. Their joke shop became something bigger, a refuge, a morale boost, a weaponized burst of joy in a world grown too gray. They even invented items that could disarm, disorient, escape, tools disguised as toys. And deep down, everyone knew what it meant. The twins were preparing for war in their own way. And when they finally left Hogwarts early with fireworks exploding and Umbridge screaming, Harry felt something rare. Hope. Because even in darkness, laughter can be a weapon too. Meanwhile, Dumbledore was changing. Not in words, not in power, in silence. He was off and away, always researching, always calculating. He didn't say much to Harry anymore, not yet. He was holding something back and Harry knew it. But not out of mistrust, out of protection. Because what Dumbledore was uncovering wasn't just dangerous, it was devastating. He was chasing pieces of Voldemort's soul. He was tracing bloodlines, murders, ancient spells, searching for how one man could have survived death so many times. And eventually, Dumbledore found the word, Horcrux, but not yet for Harry. That truth was still sealed. For now. The Daily Prophet kept printing warnings. Muggle news reports showed freak weather, train accidents, disappearances. The patterns were there, if you knew how to read them. But the real shift came in whispers. In families no longer speaking. In wizards withdrawing their children from Hogwarts. In the unspoken truth that things would not go back to normal. There was no going back. Then, without warning, Arthur Weasley was attacked. It happened in the Department of Mysteries late at night. Harry didn't dream it. He was it. He saw it through the snake's eyes. Felt the coils. Smelled the blood. When he woke, he was screaming. And for a second, just a second, he wasn't sure who he was. Was he Harry? Or was he him? That incident changed everything. Not just because Mr. Weasley survived, but because it proved it. The connection was real. Voldemort was using Harry like a window. Maybe even a weapon. That was when Dumbledore ordered it, a clemency. Harry had to learn to close his mind. Seal the link. Protect himself, and everyone else, from becoming pawns. Snape was chosen to teach him. And that was a disaster waiting to happen. A clemency wasn't about spells. It was about control, memory, emotion. You had to dig into your own pain and erase its power. But with Snape, that pain got twisted. Snape threw Harry into memory after memory, pulling at wounds, exposing weaknesses. And Harry, proud and angry and too much like his father, resisted. Failed. Again and again. He wanted to learn. But he couldn't trust the man teaching him. And Snape? He had wounds too. One night, Harry's curiosity got the better of him. He saw one of Snape's memories by accident. And what he saw changed everything. It was a young Snape being bullied by Harry's father, James Potter. Arrogant, cruel, laughing while Snape was humiliated. Harry froze. Because the image didn't match the man he'd imagined his whole life. It cracked something inside him. It wasn't just about Voldemort anymore. It was about identity. Harry was starting to question everything. The adults he trusted, the legacy he carried, the history he thought he knew. Nothing was black and white. And maybe it never had been. The dreams kept coming. Visions of corridors, doors, darkness. Something was pulling Harry to the Department of Mysteries. Something important. And it wasn't just him. Voldemort was trying to lure him there, using the one thing he knew Harry couldn't ignore. His friends. One night, the dream became too real. Harry saw Sirius, trapped, tortured, screaming in pain. He knew it was happening. He felt it. And so he ran. Straight to Dumbledore. But Dumbledore wasn't there. And time was ticking. So Harry made a choice. The kind of choice that forges you, or destroys you. He gathered his friends. Ron, Hermione, Ginny, Luna, Neville. They didn't hesitate. They knew it might be a trap. But they also knew the truth. Some things are worth the risk. And loyalty doesn't check for logic. They broke into the Ministry that night. 6 teenagers against a system built on centuries. And what they found was worse than a trap. It was a battlefield. The Department of Mysteries was not what it seemed. Rooms filled with time. With death. With memory. With prophecy. And then, the Death Eaters came. They weren't just faceless cloaked figures anymore. They had names. Bellatrix Lestrange. Lucius Malfoy. Dolohov. and others masked and merciless. They wanted the prophecy, the one that could only be lifted by Harry, and they would kill to get it. What followed was chaos, spells flying, shadows shifting, fear and fire and screaming. Neville broke bones. Ginny stood her ground. Luna moved like smoke, graceful and eerie. Hermione fell, hexed into unconsciousness. Ron fought blindly, then collapsed, cursed. And Harry? Harry ran with the prophecy clutched in his hand. But he was losing. They were all losing. And then came the moment that split time in two. Sirius appeared, dueling Bellatrix, defiant, wild, magnificent. And then, she struck. A flash of green, a gasp, and Sirius black. The closest thing Harry had to family, fall. Right through the veil. Gone. Time stopped. Harry screamed, but the veil didn't answer. The world became noise. Anger. Pure, unfiltered rage. He chased Bellatrix, ready to kill. And Voldemort appeared. For a moment it was just the two of them. Face to face. One to one. And then Dumbledore. The duel between the two greatest wizards of the age. Light against darkness. Fire against shadow. No words. Just power. The ministry was shattered. But it was also exposed. Because they saw it. The minister. The Aurors. The press. Voldemort was back. No more lies. No more denial. Just truth. Too late to save Sirius. But maybe, just maybe, not too late to save the world. It wasn't supposed to be like this. Not after everything they'd been through. But here Harry was, alone again, in the hospital wing. Staring at white sheets. Hearing nothing but the distant footsteps of Madame Pomfrey. And realizing that this wasn't just a defeat. It was a fracture. A shattering of innocence. Sirius was gone. He wasn't coming back. Not through magic. Not through dreams. Not even in the mirror Harry still carried with him, tucked inside a drawer he could never open without trembling. They told him it wasn't his fault. Dumbledore. Lupin. Even Hermione, whose voice cracked trying to reach him. But deep down Harry couldn't believe that. He had seen the door. The prophecy room. The trap. And he had walked into it. Because he couldn't not go. Because Sirius was family. Because love can make you reckless when it whispers through fear. But now, there was no one to save. Only grief. And silence. And rage. Dumbledore finally spoke to him. Really spoke. He brought Harry into his office and laid it all bare. The prophecy. The connection. The reason he had kept Harry at a distance all year. Because he had cared too much. Because he was afraid that love would cloud his judgment, and that it already had. And then Dumbledore said something that broke Harry open. Neither can live while the other survives. It wasn't just prophecy. It was a sentence. A life handed over to fate. Harry wasn't just a boy with a scar anymore. He was the only one who could end this war, and the only one Voldemort would ever truly fear. But not because of power. Because of choice. Because of the thing Voldemort could never understand. That Harry would fight not to conquer, but to protect. And in that moment Harry finally saw the difference. Voldemort killed to gain immortality. Harry was ready to die so others could live. Days passed like fog. The ministry spun the narrative. They honored the dead, but quietly. They published carefully worded press releases. They tried to regain control. But the truth was out now. The wizarding world knew. Voldemort was back. And Harry wasn't just a student anymore. He was a symbol. A survivor. A warning. The Daily Prophet printed his name with respect again. But Harry didn't care. Respect didn't bring Sirius back. It didn't unmake the moment he watched his godfather fall behind the veil. A curtain that looked so ordinary. Until it took everything. The aftermath changed people. Neville walked differently now. Straighter. Quieter. There was power in his spells, not anger but purpose. Luna still spoke in riddles. Still saw things no one else could. But Harry had stopped laughing. Because sometimes madness carries more truth than sanity ever dares to say. Ron and Hermione stayed close. Closer than ever. Not just friends now but comrades. People who had walked into death beside you. Who had screamed your name across a battlefield and refused to leave you behind. They didn't ask for this. But they wouldn't turn away from it either. The order grew quieter, more secretive. Meetings happened late at night in places even Harry didn't know. Dumbledore was preparing for something. Gathering intelligence. Watching. Waiting. And inside Harry something had shifted. Not just grief. Not just anger. But resolve. He didn't care about glory anymore. He didn't care about grades or Quidditch or house points. He wanted to understand. What made Voldemort who he was. What he feared. What he hid. What parts of his soul he had torn away, and where they were buried. Because if this war had to end with Harry, then he'd be ready. Even if that meant giving up the rest of his childhood. Even if it meant walking the same road as Sirius, and not returning. As the Hogwarts Express pulled away at the end of term, Harry stared out the window. The world didn't look different. But he was. He wasn't the boy who lived anymore. He was the boy who chose. To fight. To grieve. To love, even knowing what it could cost. Because the prophecy didn't just name him as the one who could defeat Voldemort. It reminded him of who he truly was. A boy with a scar. A friend with a purpose. A son with a legacy. And a heart that would burn through the darkness. The summer began like most others. Quiet, unbearable, and filled with that hollow tension that always lingered around Privet Drive. But this time, the silence wasn't just from the Dursleys. It came from inside Harry. From the aching void Sirius had left behind. There were no letters at first. No daily updates from the Order. No comforting lines from Ron or Hermione. Just the empty ticking of the clock, the unbearable hum of the heat, and the memory of Sirius's laughter echoing in the corners of Harry's mind like a cruel ghost. Even Hedwig seemed quieter. As if she too had felt the world shift. Eventually letters arrived. Hermione's careful handwriting. Ron's shorter, clumsier notes. They told him what little they could. That the Order was still watching. That Dumbledore was still planning. That things were changing, but no one knew how fast. Muggle news was full of disasters. Collapsing bridges, freak storms, mysterious disappearances. But Harry knew better. This wasn't coincidence. This was Voldemort. Working in the shadows. Stirring chaos. Masking movement with mayhem. The war had begun, but no one could see it yet. When the letter from Dumbledore came, it wasn't long or detailed. It simply said, "Be ready." That was it. 2 words that weighed heavier than a prophecy. Because Harry knew, Dumbledore wasn't just asking him to pack. He was asking him to become something. To carry the burden of truth, leadership, and war, without losing who he was. Then came the trip back to the burrow. But it wasn't the same as before. The house was still warm, still cluttered, still full of life. But now it felt like a sanctuary hiding from a storm. Tonks was there, a little more serious. Moody never took off his cloak. Mr. Weasley kept checking the sky when he thought no one was looking. And Mrs. Weasley, she hugged Harry longer than usual. As if afraid he might vanish too. The conversations had changed. No more talk of school gossip or Quidditch teams. Now it was reports of disappearances. Auntie Emmeline gone missing. A curse found on a child's toy. A whole family vanished from a countryside village. No traces, just screams that never stopped echoing. And no one dared say Voldemort's name. Not because they feared it, but because they knew he was listening. Every word. Every whisper. And names carried weight and magic. At night, Harry stayed up listening. To the sounds of the burrow breathing. To the crackling fireplace. To Lupin's murmurs with Tonks, low and urgent. Sometimes he wandered the hallways. Not out of fear, but because sleep never came easily anymore. Not after what he'd seen. Not after hearing Bellatrix laugh as Sirius fell. One night, he caught Ginny sitting alone at the kitchen table. She didn't say much. Just pushed over a cup of tea and sat with him in silence. And somehow, that helped more than any words. Grief doesn't always need to be solved. Sometimes it just needs to be witnessed. Training began quietly. Not dueling. Not wand work. But questions. Dumbledore wanted Harry to ask questions. What makes a memory powerful? What happens to a soul when it's split? What is the cost of immortality? These weren't classroom lessons. They were warnings. Because Voldemort hadn't just sought power. He had destroyed pieces of himself to keep death away. And Harry needed to understand that if he was ever going to stop him. Back at Hogwarts, things weren't the same. The Ministry couldn't pretend anymore, but that didn't mean they trusted Dumbledore. Fudge was gone, yes. But fear had taken his place. And in fear, people do foolish things. They whispered. They blamed. They looked at Harry not as a liar now, but as a weapon. And weapons are dangerous when they start thinking for themselves. Even some students kept their distance. They weren't sure what to believe. They'd read the headlines. They'd seen the aftermath. But no one wanted to admit that a war was coming. It was easier to pretend it was someone else's fight. That Voldemort would stay in the shadows and the school walls would protect them. But Harry knew better. So did Neville. So did Luna. So did every member of Dumbledore's army who had stood in the Department of Mysteries, wand raised and heart pounding. And quietly that army didn't disband. They just evolved. No more secret meetings in the room of requirement. Now it was passing spells in the hallway. Testing shield charms during lunch. exchanging hexes like code. Because when the world goes dark, the light doesn't wait for permission. It just finds a way to burn brighter. One evening, Harry stood at the edge of the astronomy tower. The wind was sharp. The stars were distant. And in that moment, he felt the weight of everything pressing down. Sirius, the prophecy, the future. But he also felt something else. A pulse of resolve. A quiet fire. The knowledge that he had been broken, but not beaten. That love, even in its most painful form, had given him the one thing Voldemort never had. A reason. Not to dominate. Not to survive. But to protect. To fight. To live. You would think after everything that Harry might be numb. That grief would finally harden into something immovable. That he'd stop caring, stop feeling, because how much loss can one heart take before it breaks completely? But that's the thing about Harry Potter. He doesn't go numb. He burns. Quietly. Fiercely. Always. The school year moved forward, but nothing felt normal anymore. Not after the ministry fell silent again. Not after the names started showing up in the obituaries. Not after people started vanishing in the night and no one asked where they went. And not after Dumbledore pulled Harry aside and said, "It's time. Time to stop pretending this was just about school. Time to learn what Voldemort had done to make himself immortal. Time to begin the true journey." In the days that followed, Harry met Dumbledore not as a student, but as an heir. Not to a throne, but to a mission, to a legacy. Dumbledore began telling Harry everything. Not in riddles. In truth. He spoke of a boy named Tom Riddle. A child who had never known love. Who collected power like trophies and treated people like tools. A boy who grew into a monster, not by accident but by choice. Because Tom had split his soul. Again. And again. And again. They were called Horcruxes. Objects infused with pieces of soul, created through murder. And Voldemort didn't make one. He made 7. Because death terrified him so deeply, he wanted to scatter himself into pieces. To survive anything. Even the end. Even fate. Even Harry. Dumbledore told Harry that these Horcruxes had to be found and destroyed, all of them, before Voldemort could truly die. That was the task. Not a duel. Not a prophecy. A hunt. One that might last years. That might cost more lives. And that, in the end, would fall to Harry alone. Because Voldemort had made Harry his mirror. And only someone who had been marked, scarred, could end what had been started. But Dumbledore also told him something else. You are protected, Harry. Not by my spells. Not by prophecy. But by your mother's love. That protection, ancient, pure, selfless, ran through his blood. It lived in his very skin. And that was the one thing Voldemort had never understood. That love isn't weakness. It's the only kind of magic stronger than fear. As the term ended, Harry walked the castle grounds one last time. The sun was setting. The lake was still. The walls of Hogwarts, so familiar, now felt like something behind him, something finished. Because Harry wasn't a student anymore. Not really. He was a soldier, a seeker, a symbol. And yet, under all that, he was still just a boy who missed his parents, who missed Sirius, who wanted to live in a world where people weren't killed for love. When the train pulled out of the station, Harry sat with Ron and Hermione. No words were needed. They had already made their choice. They would follow him. To the ends of the earth. Because this war, this final war, was no longer someone else's story. It belonged to them now. To every kid who stood up in the dark and said, no more. To every friend who had lost someone and kept going anyway. To every ordinary person who had chosen courage over comfort. And Harry? He didn't know where the road would lead. But he knew this. He wasn't afraid anymore. Because death wasn't the enemy. Fear was. And love. Love was the weapon. This was the Order of the Phoenix. Not just a group. Not just a rebellion. But a promise. That the light, no matter how small, would never stop burning. Even in the darkest hour. Especially then. Because sometimes, a boy becomes a symbol. And a symbol becomes the beginning of everything.